Nice patch, pirate princess. The words sliced through the morning air like a blade designed to cut deep. Corporal Jake Martinez smirked as he stepped back into formation, his voice carrying just far enough to ensure everyone heard. That was always the point with Martinez: maximum humiliation, minimum consequence. But before we reveal how Captain Voss's eye patch would silence an entire military base and expose the hero they never knew they had, let me ask you this. Where in the world are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments, and if this story gives you chills, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. Captain Alexis Voss walked past the training yard with measured steps, her black eye patch stark against her pale skin. The jagged scar that ran from her left temple down to her cheek caught the harsh sunlight, creating shadows that made her face look like a battlefield map. She didn't flinch at Martinez's comment, didn't adjust her pace, didn't even glance in his direction. Her remaining eye stayed fixed ahead, her posture military straight, her silence somehow more unsettling than any response would have been. Behind her, the unit shifted restlessly. Some chuckled quietly at Martinez's joke, others watched with detached curiosity. Captain Voss had been transferred to Fort Braxton 3 weeks ago, arriving with minimal fanfare and even less explanation. All anyone knew was that she'd been reassigned from a classified posting, whatever that meant. The official word was medical leave, but the whispers in the barracks painted a different picture. The patch over her left eye and the scar tissue surrounding it told a story none of them had bothered to read properly. Instead, they filled in the blanks with assumptions. Some said she'd been injured in a training accident. Others claimed she'd been caught in an IED blast during a routine patrol. The boldest rumors suggested she'd cracked under pressure and hurt herself. All of them were wrong, but truth had never been a requirement for barracks gossip. Martinez felt emboldened by the scattered laughter from his audience. He'd been testing boundaries since Voss arrived, pushing to see how far he could go before she'd snap. Her consistent lack of response only made him bolder. There was something about her silence that irritated him, something about the way she carried herself that suggested she thought she was better than the rest of them. What Martinez didn't understand, what none of them comprehended, was that Captain Alexis Voss wasn't ignoring them out of weakness. She was restraining herself out of discipline. The kind of discipline that came from operations where silence meant survival, where emotional control was the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The morning continued with its usual rhythm. Physical training, weapons maintenance, tactical briefings. Through it all, Voss moved like a ghost among them, present but somehow separate. She completed every task with mechanical precision, spoke only when directly addressed, and maintained the kind of professional distance that made even the boldest soldiers hesitate before approaching her. During the afternoon weapons inspection, Private Tommy Reed noticed how Voss held her M4 rifle. Despite the eye patch, her grip was perfect, her stance flawless. When she raised the weapon to sight down the barrel, there was no hesitation, no compensation for her missing depth perception. She handled the rifle like it was an extension of her body, like someone who had spent years perfecting movements that others struggled to learn. That should have been the first clue. But Reed was too busy laughing at Martinez's latest joke to pay attention to the details that mattered. The mess hall buzzed with its usual evening energy when Voss entered for dinner. Conversations didn't stop, but they shifted slightly, voices dropping just enough to create that peculiar atmosphere that surrounds someone who doesn't quite fit. She moved through the serving line with practiced efficiency, accepting her meal without comment, finding an empty table in the corner where she could eat in peace. Martinez watched her from across the room, surrounded by his usual crowd of enablers. He'd been working on new material all day, crafting insults that would hit just the right note of cruelty without crossing into actionable territory. Military humor was a delicate art form, requiring precision to avoid serious consequences. "Wonder if she sees double when she aims," Martinez muttered to his table mates, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Probably why she got kicked out of whatever unit she came from. Can't have a Cyclops watching your six." The laughter that followed was louder than it should have been, fueled by the peculiar mob mentality that overtakes groups when they sense weakness. But if any of them had bothered to look closely at Voss, they would have noticed that she wasn't displaying weakness at all. She was displaying control. The kind of control that came from years of training, from situations where maintaining composure wasn't just professional. It was survival. Voss finished her meal methodically, cleaned her tray, and left the mess hall without acknowledging the attention. Her exit was as unremarkable as her entrance, except for the slight tightening around her visible eye that suggested she'd heard every word. Later that evening, Master Sergeant David Crawford approached Martinez near the barracks. Crawford was old-school military, with 30 years of service and the kind of weathered face that came from deployments in places most people couldn't pronounce. He'd been watching the interactions between Martinez and Voss with growing concern. "You might want to ease up on the new captain," Crawford said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "There are things you don't understand about this situation." Martinez looked up from the magazine he'd been reading, his expression shifting from casual to defensive. "She's just another officer who couldn't cut it, Sarge. Look at her. She can barely see straight. How's she supposed to lead soldiers into combat?" Crawford's expression hardened slightly. "It's not your determination to make, Corporal. And you'd be wise to remember that appearances can be deceiving." The warning went unheeded. Martinez had momentum now and the approval of his peers. He'd found a target that didn't fight back, and in the cruel mathematics of military social dynamics, that made her fair game. The next morning brought news of an unscheduled inspection by the regional command. Colonel Patricia Hayes, a decorated veteran with a reputation for thoroughness, would be arriving that afternoon to assess the unit's readiness. The announcement sent ripples of activity through the base as soldiers scrambled to prepare for scrutiny. Voss received the news with the same stoic expression she wore for everything else. She methodically cleaned her gear, organized her paperwork, and prepared for inspection with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of experience with high-stakes evaluations. Martinez saw the inspection as an opportunity. If he could demonstrate Voss's incompetence in front of the colonel, maybe they'd finally transfer her somewhere she couldn't embarrass the unit. He began planning subtle ways to highlight her limitations, to draw attention to the eye patch and the questions it raised about her fitness for duty. What Martinez didn't know was that Colonel Hayes had specifically requested to visit Fort Braxton after receiving a routine personnel report. One name on that report had caught her attention, triggering a series of secure phone calls and classified file reviews. The inspection wasn't routine at all. It was a verification mission. The afternoon inspection proceeded with military precision. Colonel Hayes moved through the barracks, examining equipment, questioning soldiers, and evaluating the unit's overall readiness. Her demeanor was professional, but sharp, the kind of focused attention that made even experienced soldiers nervous. When she reached Voss's area, Hayes paused. The captain stood at attention, her uniform immaculate, her visible eye fixed straight ahead. The colonel examined her gear with particular care, noting the meticulous organization, the pristine condition of every item. But it was when Hayes looked directly at Voss that the atmosphere changed. Recognition flickered across the colonel's face, followed by something that looked like surprise, then respect. The change was subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Martinez wasn't paying attention. He was too busy preparing his subtle undermining tactics, too focused on his own agenda to notice the shift in the room's energy. Colonel Hayes stepped closer to Voss, her voice dropping to a level that only those nearby could hear. She spoke a single phrase so quietly that most missed it entirely. Storm Eagle. The effect was immediate and profound. Voss's posture, already military perfect, somehow became even more rigid. Her visible eye flickered with something that might have been pain or pride or both. For the first time since arriving at Fort Braxton, she looked fully present, fully engaged with her surroundings. Hayes stepped back, her expression now openly respectful. She raised her hand in a crisp salute, a gesture that violated every protocol of military hierarchy. Colonels didn't salute captains, ever, unless the silence that followed was deafening. Every soldier in the immediate area stopped what they were doing, stopped breathing, stopped thinking. They watched as their captain, the woman they'd been mocking for weeks, returned the salute with precision that spoke of countless repetitions in circumstances they couldn't imagine. Martinez felt the blood drain from his face. The magazine he'd been pretending to read slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers. Around him, his fellow soldiers stared with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning horror. Colonel Hayes turned to address the assembled group, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades in positions of ultimate responsibility. For those of you who don't know, you've been serving alongside Captain Alexis Voss, call sign Storm Eagle. Captain Voss led the operation that extracted the diplomatic team from the Kandahar compound 3 years ago. She personally carried 2 wounded civilians through enemy fire after taking shrapnel to the face and losing her left eye. The words hit the formation like physical blows. Martinez remembered reading about that operation, about the mysterious team leader who had accomplished the impossible under conditions that should have been fatal. He'd never connected that legend to the quiet woman he'd been tormenting. Hayes continued, her voice growing harder with each word. Captain Voss volunteered for this assignment after her medical leave. She could have taken a desk job, could have retired with full honors. Instead, she chose to return to active duty, to continue serving despite injuries that would have ended lesser careers. The colonel's gaze swept over the assembled soldiers, lingering particularly on Martinez. I trust that each of you will remember this moment, will remember that true courage often wears the scars of service, and that those scars deserve respect, not mockery. With that, Hayes turned and walked away, leaving behind a silence so complete it seemed to absorb sound itself. The soldiers remained frozen, processing information that recontextualized everything they thought they knew about their captain. Martinez stared at Voss, seeing her clearly for the first time. The eye patch wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a badge of honor. The scar wasn't a disfigurement, it was evidence of sacrifice. Her silence wasn't submission, it was the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing left to prove. Voss herself remained at attention for several more seconds before finally relaxing her posture. She gathered her gear with the same methodical precision she'd shown since arriving, but now every movement seemed to carry additional weight. The woman who had been invisible was suddenly the most important person in the room. As the formation began to disperse, Martinez found himself unable to move. The weight of his actions, of his words, of his casual cruelty pressed down on him like a physical force. He had spent weeks attacking a genuine hero, had turned her sacrifice into a source of entertainment. The realization was devastating. Every joke, every sneer, every moment of mockery came flooding back with new context. He had been humiliating someone who had earned the right to his deepest respect, had been treating courage as weakness, had been mistaking discipline for defeat. Master Sergeant Crawford appeared beside him, his expression grim but not without sympathy. "Now you understand," he said quietly. "Some people don't need to announce their accomplishments. Some people let their actions speak for themselves." Martinez nodded numbly, still staring at the spot where Voss had stood. The casual confidence that had sustained him for weeks was gone, replaced by shame so profound it felt like physical illness. That evening, the barracks was unusually quiet. Conversations were subdued, laughter rare. Word of the day's revelation had spread through the unit like wildfire, carrying with it a collective sense of shame and regret. Martinez sat on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction with Voss through the lens of his new understanding. The woman he'd dismissed as damaged goods was actually one of the most decorated soldiers on the base. The scars he'd mocked were evidence of heroism beyond anything he'd ever attempted. Sleep came fitfully that night, haunted by the memory of Colonel Hayes' words and the weight of his own failures. When morning came, Martinez knew that something fundamental had changed. The casual cruelty that had seemed so harmless before now felt like a betrayal of everything the uniform was supposed to represent. Captain Alexis Voss continued her duties with the same quiet professionalism she'd shown since arriving. But now, when she walked past the training yard, soldiers stood a little straighter. When she entered the mess hall, conversations paused out of respect rather than curiosity. When she gave orders, they were followed without question or comment. The transformation was subtle but complete. The woman who had been invisible was now impossible to ignore. The captain who had been dismissed was now recognized for what she had always been, a leader who had earned her place through sacrifice, courage, and an unshakable commitment to service. Martinez never found the courage to apologize directly. The magnitude of his behavior made words seem inadequate. Instead, he demonstrated his regret through action, through the kind of professional respect that should have been offered from the beginning. And Captain Voss, with the wisdom that comes from surviving the unsurvivable, accepted this new dynamic without comment. She had always known her worth. Now, finally, so did everyone else. The eye patch remained, as did the scar. But they were no longer sources of mockery. They were reminders that some battles leave visible marks, and that those marks should be worn with pride by those who bear them and respected by those who observe them. In the end, the only thing that changed was perspective. Captain Alexis Voss had always been a hero. It had just taken time for everyone else to see it. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never speak of their strength. The most courageous are those who walk quietly through mockery, carrying scars that tell stories others could never survive hearing. In a world quick to judge by appearances, remember that the person you underestimate today might be the hero who would risk everything to save you tomorrow. True valor doesn't demand recognition. It simply endures, waiting for the moment when those who mocked finally understand what they were really looking at.